Hello, everyone. My name is Colin Ellard, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to present to you some of my ideas about cities. What I'd like to do in this talk is to begin by giving you kind of a very broad overview of what I think cities are for, and then to go on to describe some specific experiments from my lab that pertain to these ideas, and then finally to sum up with some conclusions. Really one big conclusion, I think, and that's signaled by the title of the talk, this relationship between vitality and autonomy. So I usually like to begin here when I talk about cities. This is a very old structure, ruins really, in an area in Turkey referred to as Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is the remains of a mysterious built setting around 11 or 12,000 years old. So actually one of the oldest set of built structures that we know of. And this structure interests me for a lot of reasons. I should acknowledge with thanks my colleague, the architect Douglas MacLeod, for introducing me to this architectural wonder. And as you can see from this photograph, the main part of Göbekli Tepe consists of a set of stelae or stone columns. And those stone columns have some elaborate carving placed on them, as illustrated here. One of the wonders of Göbekli Tepe is that it was built at a time before there were cities, before there were settlements, or sedimentation, as the anthropologists and archaeologists call this stage of human development. And yet we know from, this is obviously an artist's rendition of what the building of Göbekli Tepe might have looked like, but we know from the structures that are there that it would have required the coming together of a fairly large number of people, as is illustrated in this rendition. And so what's really interesting about that is that these individuals living in kind of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle would have thought it worthwhile to come together to build these structures. The modern discoverer of Göbekli Tepe was an archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who's passed now. He's no longer with us. But one of the most significant things that I think that he said was this, that first came the temple, then the city. And what he meant by that was that there is a tendency in archaeology, or has been, to consider that the ancient origins of built structures in architecture came from sedimentation. So we gathered together into larger groups, we settled down, we had agriculture, and in part as a consequence of all of that, we had to build cities. We had to build walls, we had to build structures, dwellings, and so on and so forth. And Schmidt said, no, look at this. This is a structure that was designed and built long before any of that happened. And he called it a temple. Truthfully, we don't really know what Göbekli Tepe was for. We can just make guesses. So people ordinarily say it's maybe was a site of healing, maybe it was a site of worship, hence the word temple and this quote from Schmidt. We're not sure. The nature of the carvings on the stelae, which are of often fearsome animals, some sort of loosely based on animals that might have lived at that time, and others more fantasy, have led some people, including me, to think that the purpose of Göbekli Tepe might have had something to do with a particular problem that human beings had as we emerged. And that is that we became aware of our mortality. So there's a technical term for this, which is mortality salience. And there's an entire theory of so-called terror management, which argues that one of the great motivations for human beings is to manage our terror of the fact that we know that we will all, as individuals, die. And how do we confront that terror? How do we, in the words of Ernest Becker, who wrote this beautiful book called The Denial of Death. How do we deny death? How do we confront that terror of mortality? And so one idea is that structures like Göbekli Tepe, and Göbekli Tepe would have been one of the first, I think, to do this, was meant as kind of a salve against mortality. It was meant as a way of helping us to manage our emotions about the facts of life. So to the extent that that is true, I'm going to see if I can move my face here because I'm getting in the way of the captions I see. To the extent that that might be true, one potential answer to the question of what architecture might be for is that it might have to do with the management of emotions. So oftentimes when we think of the built environment, we think of it very pragmatically as being for giving us places to live, to get shelter from the elements, to store our stuff, and so on and so forth. But the evidence of Göbekli Tepe and many other kinds of evidence as well, I think, suggests that the role that buildings have in generating and managing emotions may be fundamental to what buildings and architecture are actually for. Okay, now I'm going to take, whoops. I never promised this would be completely smooth. Now I'm going to take somewhat of a tangent and talk about something that some of you might have heard of called Dunbar's number. And I want to relate it again to what cities I think are all about, urban life among strangers, as I've said here. Robin Dunbar is a primatologist who has been very interested in the relationships between social behavior and brain development, especially in primates. And so here's a human brain. This proves that I'm a neuroscientist. I have a picture of a brain. That's a joke. Here's a piece of data from Dunbar's work. This is a graph, obviously, which shows on one axis the size of neocortex relative to the rest of the brain. So the neocortex, as you probably already know, is the outer mantle, the outside part of the brain where historically, for better or for worse, we've always thought that's the part of the brain that has the fancy gear for doing cognition and some other kinds of things as well. And on the other axis, as you can see, we have average social group size. And so the interest here is that there is a relationship between those two things. The larger your group size is, as it turns out, the larger your neocortex is. And Dunbar said there's a good reason for this. And the reason, he said, is that living in a group, for all of its advantages, and there are advantages, living in a group exerts kind of a toll, a tax on people's lives. The larger the group in which you live, the more complicated it becomes to remember, say, for example, social interactions, to remember who's who and who has done what to whom. And so in that sense, Dunbar said it makes perfect sense that there'd be this relationship that's shown in this slide. What's really interesting is that if you look at the predicted group size, the predicted human group size, given the size of our neocortex, as you can see from the graph, if you follow along that dotted line, based on what we know of the size of our neocortex relative to the rest of our brains, that number comes out to something like around 150. And so that number around 150, sometimes it's a little bit less. I think some people give it more precision, which probably is not really all that great an idea. It's around 150. So what that means is that our brains are adapted to being able to manage social life in groups of about 150 people at the most. Now, there was a time, and this is an illustration on the diagram shows a typical kind of very early settlement, and as you can see, it's very schematic. The idea basically is just to show that these early settlements, such as they were, would have been very small. They would have been settlements in which everyone was living outside virtually all of the time. The photograph at bottom right is meant to give kind of a vague, obviously it's not a photograph from those times, but meant to give kind of a vague idea of the lifestyle of people living at that time in a settlement such as this. And those settlements, Dunbar would argue, would be well within the range of what's come to be called Dunbar's number. So those settlements with everybody outside all the time, within one another's view, privacy is a little bit strange to even think about in that kind of settlement. That would have been well within the capacities of our brain. But here's how we live now. This is a photograph taken from Grand Central Station in New York back in the before times when people gathered in big crowds and didn't wear masks, and hopefully those days will come back for us sometime. But obviously what you see here is a massive number of people, far more than 150 people, even in this train station. And if you think of your own life, if you're living in a city, then you know that you're on a daily basis in contact with well more than 150 people. And you may well have to deal with many more than 150 people in your working and in your leisure life. So because of all of that, one very simple way of putting this is, as the noted urbanist Jane Jacobs said, cities are, by definition, full of strangers. Because of our density in cities, we can't manage to live within the bounds of Dunbar's number. And there's even some neuroscience evidence suggesting that living in great numbers in high density in cities exerts an effect on our brains. So I've called this a recent imaging study. It's fading into being less recent now, but nevertheless, it was a landmark study conducted by Florian Lederbogen and their team, published in 2011. And I won't go through all of the details of the experiment. I think this is an experiment that's become well known. It's easy to look up for yourselves, but I'll give you the bottom line, which is simply that people who live in big cities are more reactive to social stress than people who live in rural settings. And you can actually measure that in an imaging experiment by looking at the response of a brain area named the amygdala to a social stress situation. And the social stress, just to tell you a little bit about the study, involved somebody being given mental arithmetic problems and then receiving false feedback about how well they were doing. So in other words, they were led to believe that they were doing really badly, worse than they actually were. And that made them stressed, and that lit up the amygdala, and that effect was bigger in urban dwellers than it was in rural dwellers. So there's even some evidence that living among strangers, as Jacobs put it, has this potentially deleterious effect on the function and perhaps even the structure of our brains. So one way that I think about all of that sometimes is, as I've said here, to consider that urban design acts as a kind of cognitive prosthesis, that the point of a city is to buffer us from the exigencies of biology, that we have a brain that's adapted for living in groups of about 150. We far exceed that group size in large cities. And so we manage that essentially by design, by quite specifically by using walls. Okay, so here again, another bit of a segue. So from this point to the end of my talk, I want to talk about different kinds of ways in which we can manage the psychological sustainability, let's say, of urban environments. And I'd like to begin by talking about facades specifically. Okay, so by facade, I mean just the outer surface of buildings. And typically when we think of building facades and their influence on human behavior, we think, following the pioneers in this area, and I'll talk very briefly about a couple of the pioneers, we think that the bottom part of the facade is up to about 2 or 3 meters, that's the critical part of a building facade. So this kind of thinking began with an urbanist named William White, who's pictured here. White did some really clever behavioral studies from afar. He just basically watched people with some simple tools like paper and pencil and stopwatches, and measured people's behavior in different kinds of settings. And he illustrated the manner in which the layout of space and the design of a building facade influenced human behavior. Following in his footsteps is the noted and still active urbanist Jan Gehl, who these days is a bit of a legend. He has written extensively and published online guides for what he calls how to study public life. And Gehl's approaches are very much standing on the shoulders of William White's approaches, but with more sophistication, more finesse. So there are actually even freely available apps that one can use to conduct experiments, measurements of the way that people inhabit and move through public settings. So I want to give just a little bit of an example of the flavor of that kind of approach just from my own work. And this is just a quick and simple study that I was asked to do some years ago, having to do with construction sites and, as it turns out, public art. So I was asked to give a presentation, this was many years ago now, on the psychology of construction sites. And I thought, what do I do for such a mission? And as I was thinking about this, I stumbled upon this construction site in the city of Toronto, just purely by accident. And you can see the basics here. You can see that there's a chain link fence with some forbidding barbed wire at the top of it. And attached to this fence is these are laser cut plywood shapes painted black. And behind all of that, you can see that there's this open construction site that was in some kind of legal dispute for many years. So nothing could be built there. It had to be fenced off, but the city in its wisdom did not want this ugly, bare, potentially hazardous site left as it was. So they commissioned a public art competition, and the winners of the competition designed these kinds of panels. And so here's another view of another part of the fence. The idea was to put images on the fence that resonated with the actual neighborhood in which the art was placed. Some had landscape, some had birds. These are actually pigeons. And it was kind of beyond being a nice image of wildlife, it was a whimsical reference to the goings on in the neighborhood, where there were some elderly people who actually fed pigeons on their front gardens, and people were curious and remarked about this little piece of behavior. So what I decided to do was to measure whether the design of that fence actually had any impact on public life. I met with the artists who designed the fence, and they said, "Oh, you won't get anything. It's been there for years. People don't even notice it anymore." And I thought, well, we'll see. So I needed a control comparison. This was the control comparison that I used. This was another much less interesting fence, not too far away from the design fence, also surrounding a part of a construction site. So just zooming ahead to the results of this experiment, just very quickly, the methods were very simple, Jan Gehl, William White style observational methods. I basically got a student to sit at a bus stop at the corner of the block where these fences were, and to watch and measure people. And in this image, what you're seeing is measures of head turns. So on the left side of the graph, where you see control, the control site again is the unadorned construction site. You can see the thumbnail image of it, and you can see that the frequency of turns towards the fence or towards the road was about the same. So this is just turns of the head as people walk past. And then for the design fence, this was a little bit gratifying. We discovered that people were more likely to turn towards the fence than they were to turn towards the road. This is a measure of pauses. So same kind of thing, really simple, unobtrusive measures. We just recorded whenever somebody stopped for whatever reason, whether it was to tie a shoelace, light a smoke, do a little bit of smooching with their lover, or just stop and stand still, check their phone, etc. And again, we discovered that those pauses were more likely to take place in front of the design site than the control site. So cool enough, but here was the really, for us, mind-blowing finding. And that was when we looked at the speed with which people walked past either of these two kinds of fences, and discovered that in the control situation, people walked regardless of time of day and regardless of which part of the fence they were walking past. They walked at about an average speed of around 5 kilometers per hour, which, as it turns out, is kind of the average walking speed of people in cities. It varies a little bit from city to city, but that's kind of an overall good average. Now, if you look on the right side of the slide, the graph, you'll see that there's something very interesting that happened here. And that is that when people started to walk past the design fence, they were walking at about the same speed as in the control case. But when we measured the second half of their walk along this block, their walking speed had dropped to about half of what it was. So this is an extraordinarily large and interesting finding, that people, apparently without even really noticing that they were doing this, were just slowed down to about half of regular speed as they walked along the side of this interesting fence. This being a fence that had been in place, as the artist said, for years. And these people being people who were, most of them were busily commuting towards a transit station at one end of the site, or from a transit station, walking in the other direction. So by the way, that's for the picky methodological people, we did take into account directions. So half of these numbers came from walks in one direction, half from walks in the other direction. So we're pretty sure that this was a real effect. So what does that mean? Well, quite simply, it means that the design of one's surroundings in cities, and in this case, the details on a facade, if you consider the fence to be a kind of facade, have sometimes a dramatic impact on behavior. Okay, so those are unobtrusive measures from the outside. How do you go about measuring people from the inside? We spend a lot of time doing this. As I've said here, how do we measure inside a person? We might simply ask people to make responses. That's called self-assessment, obviously. Or we might use physiological measures. We can measure hearts, we can measure skin, we can measure ultimately the brain waves, if we like. I'm just going to talk about one kind of physiological measure. It's a measure called skin conductance, or electrodermal activity, or EDA. And you've probably heard of physiological lie detection methods. They're kind of hit and miss. They don't really work all that well all of the time for a variety of reasons. They may not be all that great for detecting lies, but they are pretty good for measuring physiological arousal. So using one of a variety of different kinds of mobile wearable sensors, we can measure electrodermal activity on the fly in people as they move through cities. Here's an example of what happens when you do that. This is a series of traces taken from 3 people crossing a busy street in New York City. So this was a very busy kind of complex intersection. Lots of cars, buses, taxis, many trying to turn left across the path of pedestrians. So you really kind of had to have your wits about you to make this crossing safely. And what happens is that as people cross this road, as you can see from the rising curves, is that their physiological arousal levels, as measured using these bracelets, increase. So that's kind of a proof of concept. Here is a visualization that's meant to show how you can work out what I've called here arousal contours. So those blue curtains represent the average arousal level of a group of people walking around the streets, again, of New York City. This is the Lower East Side of New York City. And you can see, without worrying about all of the fine details of what you're seeing here, the main point is to recognize that physiological arousal naturally varies as you move from one place to another in the city. And that can happen for all kinds of reasons. Noise can increase physiological arousal. Green spaces, as you can see from the bottom right part of the image, can decrease physiological arousal. But we were specifically interested in the impact of different styles of facades on arousal and also on affect, simple emotional state. I might just quickly skip over this, but this is another illustration of the use of electrodermal activity to study a site-specific issue. In this case, this was a very quick case study that we did in an area in Mumbai called the Kalinagar Junction. And the idea here was that there was a very complicated intersection that pedestrians needed to find their way across. It seemed to me from my brief stay in Mumbai that almost every intersection for a pedestrian is very complicated, but this one was kind of legend. And so again, the trace that you're seeing here is just the arousal level. In this case, it's a single case study. So this is a single person wandering around these streets. The road, the junction is towards the right side of the image. Here's a closer up view. This again is that person walking around near the junction itself. And pay special attention to the right image here and consider that this pedestrian was moving from the bottom of this image upwards, and then the left turn represents the actual crossing of the intersection. And so notice, I find this really interesting, and I might come back to this later on when I talk about agency and urban settings. Notice how the arousal level really peaks just before the person turns and starts to cross the road. So I found that very interesting, that it's not when you're in the middle of the road that your arousal level is highest in this situation. It's actually just before you get there. And there may be reasons for that. Okay, so now I want to talk specifically about an experiment that we did to measure responses to facades in the city. So a couple of examples of facades. Here's a obviously Asian, very busy facade, lots of complexity, lots of things going on in the streets. Many people, especially if they're not used to that kind of complexity in a set of facades, would find that to be unpleasant. Here is a richly complex facade, but at a more comfortable level. I think this is Copenhagen. This is, again, high complexity, generally pleasurable. So here's the experiment that we did. Here's a map showing the route that we took pedestrians on. The thumbnails on the right show the stops that we made on this walk, but again, from the standpoint of this talk, there are only a couple of these stops that I really want to talk about. Our methodology was to take people in groups, to have them wear those bracelets that I showed you, and also to have them answer questions about what they saw. You can see that some people here are holding clipboards with questionnaires on them. Some people had phone apps that they used to make responses. And the reason for the difference is just because these walks were so popular that we didn't have enough phones to hand out to everyone who came along with us. So the spillover, the late arrivals usually got the clipboards and paper. Okay, so this is a staged image from people who have worked in my lab at one time or another. You can see that they all have, they were BlackBerries actually back in the day, that they are feverishly punching in responses. And you can also see that they're wearing some hardware in their heads. I won't talk about this in this talk, but sometimes, as I mentioned briefly earlier, we do measure brain waves. And in this case, we were measuring brain waves using simple visors. The young woman on the left side of the image, you can see that she's wearing something a little different. She's wearing a device that actually measures the movements of her eyes, and we've done that sometimes too. Okay, so now to get to the experiment, we wanted to look at the effect of facade complexity on human behavior. So here are a couple of high complexity facades. The left one is in New York. The right one is in Berlin. You can see again, there's lots of different kinds of elements. There are lots of different ways, by the way, of quantifying complexity in streetscapes. There are some nice formal methods which we have sometimes used to quantify complexity. In this case, our methods were a little bit less formal and more sort of put together on the fly. These are low complexity facades, again, New York on the left and Berlin on the right. And it's pretty obvious to the eye, I think, that the number of different kinds of elements present in streetscapes like this is considerably lower than those in the images that I just showed you. And then here's a comparison of skin conductance, electrodermal activity, I called it before, in front of those low or high complexity settings. So again, pedestrians are walking the streets. They're asked to stop in particular places, and while they stop, we take measures, and we compare those measures with baseline, where baseline is how they're feeling at mission control, at this location of the mobile lab. And as you can see, the low complexity setting elicited low values of skin conductance, lower than baseline, and the high complexity setting elicited higher values. We also measured emotional state just by using simple self-assessment methods. We asked people to appraise their own feelings in the moment while they were standing in these locations. And this is not a very scientific rendition of the findings, but the basic finding was that when people were in front of a low complexity setting, not only was their physiological arousal very low, but their emotional state was also not very happy. And in contrast, in the high complexity settings, not only was physiological arousal higher, but reports of emotional state were more satisfactory as well. So this combination of low arousal and low affect or emotion is the absolute signature for boredom, which I find really interesting. I wouldn't call myself particularly an expert in boredom, but there is a nice emerging literature on this state for a whole lot of different reasons. And boredom is actually serious business. Boredom can, over the long term, exert a significant effect on even your physical health. People who are chronically bored are more likely to engage in risky behavior like crime and drug abuse. They are more prone to metabolic disorder and cardiac disorder. So I wouldn't argue that standing in front of a boring streetscape for a couple of minutes in my experiment is going to bring on a heart attack. But think of the cumulative impact of being in those kinds of settings day after day and what it might do to your brain and to your body. Again, it suggests that how we put a city together can have a measurable impact on the state of our health, both mental and physical. Okay, so there's still a lot of thinking to be done about what exactly it is about complexity that engages us. Why do we like complexity so much? Why does it resonate so well to our minds and to our bodies? And for these kinds of ideas, I like to turn to the brilliant architectural theorist Christopher Alexander, whose work I would thoroughly recommend that you take a look at if you're interested in this area. Christopher Alexander wrote a series of books collectively referred to as The Nature of Order. And I've put a long quote from Alexander on this slide, which pertains to his preoccupation with life. And he says, what we call life is a general condition which exists to some degree or other in every part of space. And further, the key to this idea is that every part of space has some degree of life, and that this degree of life is well defined objectively existing and measurable. So this is the beginnings of this idea of vitality that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk. I think that this is what Alexander is talking about. And even though he says that this degree of life is well-defined, objectively existing, and measurable, in his body of work, he didn't go very far in terms of making those well-defined measurements of vitality. Rather, he chose often to show by example, using things like this, picture pairs. So this is a pair of pictures from Alexander's books. And the simple question is, which of these two images do you think shows more life? When I give these talks live and I ask this question, there's not unanimity, but there's remarkable consistency in the responses that people have to which of the images they find has more life. What about these two? Again, this is a pair of images from Alexander's books. Which of these two images has more life? Again, I'm not going to share my thoughts with you, but I want you to just reflect on the fact that looking at these images, probably that question makes more sense for you than you might have supposed. So you may not know exactly what it is that you're tuning into, but you know that there's something there that makes this question not that hard to answer. Here's another pair of images. Which of these images has more life? This isn't from Alexander. These are a couple of images that I've used in experiments, and these are another couple of images that I've used in studies. Which of these two images has more life? And note that really, other than the human characters, the only scenes that have any indication of nature are these two on this slide. Nevertheless, for all of those images, we're easily able to answer those kinds of questions. So there's something about vitality that makes the idea make sense to us. The idea of life makes sense to us. Finding life in unexpected places makes sense to us. And when we find life, as in a richly complex facade, we like it, and so does our nervous system. Now, another little segue here. I mentioned Jane Jacobs early on with that beautifully concise definition of what a city is, that it's living among strangers. I'm a great admirer of so much of what she said, and sometimes a little frustrated that every time I think that I've had a great idea, I discover that Jane Jacobs was there many decades ago. There's a wonderful little book called Vital Little Plans, which is a set of Jane Jacobs' shorter writings. And in that book, there is one essay called, well, it was actually a speech entitled, Can Big Plans Solve the Problem of Renewal? And what Jacob says here, again, I'll read the quote: genuine rich diversity of the built environment is always the product of many, many different minds, and at its richest is also the product of different periods of time with their different aims and fashions. Making big plans doesn't bore planners, but the results bore everybody else. So I think what Jacobs was saying here, even though she didn't use the word vitality, I think there's a connection between the kinds of things that she was talking about and the ideas of Christopher Alexander. I think Jacobs and Alexander would have agreed if they'd met, I don't think they did, about the sources of vitality and where vitality comes from. And what I think Jacobs is signaling here is that one of the reasons why maybe we like vitality is in urban environments is because it sends a signal. It sends the signal to us that what we're seeing, what we're living in is the product of many different minds at different times, with different aims and fashions, all of whom have a voice, all of whom have the opportunity to exercise their autonomy, all of whom have the power to act. And I think that's the absolute key to all of this, and perhaps the absolute key to building a well-designed city. A well-designed city should have affordances for freedom of action. And I think that those affordances for freedom of action come from vitality. So the same kind of vitality that we know attracts us to scenes of explicit nature also attracts us to the best parts of cities, as illustrated in the facade studies that I showed to you, and also in the arguments of Jane Jacobs. So the best cities, I think, are the cities in which we can find our autonomy. And I think that there are explicit markers of that autonomy, which can be found particularly in the design of facades of a city, but in many other ways as well that I don't have time to talk about today. So I think that's all that I'd like to say to you. I'm really sorry that I have to do these talks online, especially recorded talks. It would be so wonderful to be able to meet you and talk to you in person. And so I did just want to close by saying that I'm completely open to communication with anyone who finds this interesting. You can get hold of me by email, and I put my email address on this slide. I do have a Twitter account. You can reach me that way if you want, or if you want to more or less keep up to date on goings on in my work, then feel free to have a look at my website, and you'll find some interesting things there, I hope. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and be well.